I'm a 36-year-old guy, and I'll be honest, I never thought I'd be in a position to write something like this. I'm not one for drama, and I've always tried to avoid conflicts. But when family gets involved, especially when money's on the line, you'd be surprised at how ugly things can get. This is the story of how my older brother, Jay, faked a medical emergency to steal what was left of my inheritance, and how I made sure he regretted it. Let me set the stage. Our dad passed away 3 years ago. He was a quiet, hardworking man who had always been careful with his money. My mom passed away when I was 12, and Dad raised us on his own after that. It wasn't easy for him. He was frugal, sometimes to a fault, but he always made sure we had what we needed. When he passed, his will left everything to be split between Jay and me. Simple enough, right? Well, not so much. Jay, who's 38, has always been the golden child. Or, at least he thought he was. He was the older son, the one who supposedly could do no wrong. But that wasn't the reality. He was always the one borrowing money, getting into debt, and sweet-talking Dad into bailing him out of whatever mess he'd gotten into. I kept my head down, went to college, worked a steady job, and built a quiet life for myself. I wasn't flashy, but I didn't need to be. Dad appreciated that. When Dad's will was read, I thought things would finally be fair for once. He'd left $400,000 to be split between us. A significant amount, but not enough to change anyone's life unless they were smart with it. I planned to put my half into savings and maybe invest in a small house. Jay, of course, had other ideas. It started small. He called me a few weeks after the funeral, asking if I'd consider letting him borrow some of my share. He said he had a great business idea, and this could be the big break he needed. I said no. I wasn't going to fund one of his ridiculous schemes, and besides, it wasn't just my decision. It was my money. He didn't take it well, but I figured that was the end of it. I was wrong. About 6 months after the will was finalized, Jay called me again. He sounded panicked. "I need you to come to the hospital," he said. "It's serious." I dropped everything and drove an hour to the hospital he'd mentioned. When I arrived, I found Jay in a hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, looking pale and weak. The nurse told me he'd been admitted for chest pains and shortness of breath. Jay said the doctors were worried it might be a heart attack or some kind of serious heart condition. I was shocked. Jay wasn't the healthiest guy, but he wasn't old either. I sat with him for hours, listening to him talk about how scared he was and how he couldn't afford the treatment he needed. He started crying, saying he didn't have insurance because he'd been self-employed. I felt a twinge of guilt. I had good health insurance through my job, and here he was, my older brother, possibly dying because he couldn't afford care. Then he dropped the bomb. He told me the doctors recommended an expensive procedure, a heart stent, and he couldn't pay for it. He said the cost was over $50,000 and that he'd try to get a loan, but couldn't. He begged me to use some of my inheritance to help him. "I don't want to die, man," he said, his voice cracking. "Please, you're all I've got." It felt like an impossible situation. I didn't want to see my brother die, but something didn't sit right. Maybe it was the timing, or maybe it was the way he kept mentioning money even before the doctors had confirmed anything. But I ignored my gut and agreed to cover the cost of the procedure. After all, he was family. Here's where it gets messy. I transferred the money directly to the hospital account he provided, thinking it was legitimate. Jay had the procedure and claimed he was recovering well. He thanked me profusely, saying I'd saved his life. For a while, I felt good about my decision, even if I'd lost a huge chunk of my inheritance. But a few months later, I got an email that made my stomach drop. It was from a friend who worked at the hospital Jay had supposedly been treated at. She said she'd seen him there that day, but that he'd been discharged the same evening. No procedure, no long-term recovery, nothing. She'd overheard him talking to someone about how he was going to turn things around now that he had cash. I felt sick. I confronted Jay immediately. He denied everything at first, but when I showed him the email, his face went pale. "Okay, fine," he snapped. "I didn't get the procedure, but I needed the money. You wouldn't have given it to me otherwise." I was furious. "You faked a medical emergency to steal from me?" I yelled. "What kind of person does that?" He tried to justify it, saying he was in a tough spot and that he'd pay me back eventually. But I knew he wouldn't. He'd done this kind of thing before, just on a smaller scale. This time, though, I wasn't going to let it slide. I spent weeks gathering evidence. I requested itemized bills from the hospital, which confirmed there was no record of a stent procedure. I combed through Jay's social media, where he'd been posting pictures of expensive dinners and new gadgets during the time he was supposedly recovering. I even hired a private investigator to dig into his finances, which revealed he'd used the money to pay off gambling debts and fund a vacation. Once I had everything, I went to a lawyer. He confirmed that I could file a civil suit for fraud. It wouldn't be easy, but I had a strong case. I decided to go for it. When Jay was served with the papers, he exploded. He called me, screaming about how I was ruining his life. I told him he'd done that to himself. The court process took months, but I stayed focused. During the trial, Jay tried to play the victim, saying I was being vindictive and that he'd planned to pay me back all along. But the evidence was damning. The hospital records, the social media posts, the PI's report, it was all there in black and white. The judge ruled in my favor. Jay was ordered to repay the full amount, plus damages. He also faced criminal charges for fraud, which resulted in probation and community service. It wasn't the life-ruining punishment he deserved, but it was something. More importantly, everyone in our family now knew what he'd done. The golden child's reputation was shattered. I like to say this whole experience brought me some kind of closure, but it didn't. Not really. Jay and I don't speak anymore, and I've accepted that we probably never will. Betrayal like that isn't something you can just get over. But at least I know I didn't let him get away with it. And maybe that's enough. If you made it this far, you're a real one. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more wild family drama, because trust me, there's always more where this came from.